Okay, so you want to own a Byzantine silk workshop. You can already picture it. A long room off a Constantinople side street, looms clacking in the half light, thread the color of wine, and fire running through a weaver's fingers, and somewhere down the road, the emperor himself wrapped in cloth that came out of a room exactly like yours. The richest fabric on earth made by your hands in the richest city on earth. Now, here's the first thing nobody tells you before you sign. The single most valuable thing your looms are physically capable of producing, the deep imperial purple that made this whole trade legendary, is the one thing you are forbidden by law to make. Weave it, and you don't just lose the cloth. You can be flogged, your head shaved as a public mark of disgrace, and everything you own taken off you by the city. In some readings of the rules, a hand as well. So the business comes down to one strange question right from the start. How do you get rich in a luxury trade where the state has reserved the top of the market for itself and made it a crime for you to reach it? Let's open one and find out. The year is around 950. The place is Constantinople, the largest, wealthiest city in the Christian world. And what you are buying has a very specific legal shape. It is not a company. It is a licensed seat inside one link of a chain the emperor deliberately broke into pieces. And to understand why, we have to start not with a loom, but with a book. Around the year 912, under the Emperor Leo VI, the office of the Eparch of Constantinople, the city prefect, the single most powerful administrator in the capital, issued a rulebook. We call it the Book of the Eparch. It is a manual for the guilds of the city, trade by trade, laying out who may buy what, from whom, at what margin, and what happens to you when you break the code. It is not folklore. It is filed regulation with penalties attached, and 5 of its chapters are about nothing but silk. Read those 5 chapters closely, and the whole world you just bought into splits open in front of you. Here is the thing they reveal, and it is the master fact of this entire business. The Byzantine state took the silk trade and chopped it into 5 separate professions, each with its own guild, and then made it illegal to belong to more than one at a time. Walk the chain. At the top sit the metaxopratai, the raw silk merchants. They buy unprocessed silk, the raw stuff called metaxa, from foreign traders, mostly Syrians, and from the provinces. Below them, the katartarioi, the silk dressers, and spinners, who take the raw fiber and clean it and prepare it for the loom. Then the serikarioi, and this is you, the ones who actually dye and weave and cut the cloth. Then the vestiopratai, the merchants who sell finished silk garments in the city. And off to one side, the prendiopratai, who deal in imported silk brought in from Syria and Baghdad. 5 guilds, 5 links, and the rule that matters more than any other. You pick one. The Book of the Eparch is blunt about it. Anyone who tries to work as both a silk merchant and a silk dyer is forced to choose one craft and drop the other, and if he's caught running both, he faces the same brutal penalties as everyone else in these pages. Flogging, shaving, confiscation. Stop and feel what that does to you as an owner. In every other business we could name, the road to real money runs through vertical integration. You buy the raw material cheap, you process it yourself, you sell it finished, and you keep every margin along the way. Here that road is closed by law. You are permanently locked into one slice. You buy your raw silk from the guild above you at their price. You sell your cloth to the guild below you at a controlled margin. You are a link, and you are forbidden from becoming the chain. That is not a flaw in the system. That is the entire point of the system. Because whoever could control silk end to end could control something the emperor was not willing to let out of his own hands. So he made sure no single private person ever could. You are about to spend a great deal of gold to become a well-paid link in somebody else's chain. So what does the link cost? Start with the license. To take over a silk workshop, the Book of the Eparch sets a tax of 10 numismata paid to the office of the Eparch, and you cannot simply pay it and walk in. You need the recommendation of the Eparch himself. The office vets you. 10 numismata. Hold that coin, because it is the unit everything in this episode is measured in. The numisma, also called the solidus, was the Byzantine gold coin, around 4.5 grams of gold, and it was the most reliable currency in the medieval world. For centuries, it held its value while everyone else's coinage rotted, and merchants from Spain to China accepted it on sight. It was, in every practical sense, the dollar of the early Middle Ages. So the first thing your capital buys is a category. This is a trade denominated in the hardest money in the world, and ordinary people did not deal in it casually. Then comes the part that should make you nervous. To open a workshop as a free man, you needed 5 people to stand as guarantors for you. Not 1, 5. And here is the sting the regulation writes in plainly. Those guarantors carried the same liability you did. If you failed, if you cheated, if you broke a rule, the people who vouched for you went down with you. So before you have woven a single thread, you have had to find 5 other human beings willing to bet their own skins on your honesty and your competence. That is a filter, and it is a hard one. It means the men who got in were already known, already trusted, already inside the web. A clever, poor, unknown weaver does not walk through that door. Now the workshop itself, looms, dye vats, a supply of raw silk you had to buy in from the dressers above you, and the real asset, the one that actually made the money, which was not a machine at all. It was the skilled hands. A master weaver who could produce fine-figured silk was the product of years of training, and there were never very many of them. Remember that, because everything that destroys this business at the end turns on exactly that fact. Your true capital could walk out the door on its own 2 legs, or be carried. Even your labor was regulated. In one of the stranger provisions of the whole book, both the silk weavers and the raw silk merchants were restricted in how they hired, with worker terms capped short on the order of a month. Historians still argue about exactly what that clause was for. The most likely reading is that it stopped any one master from locking up all the skilled labor on long contracts and cornering the trade. Whatever the intent, the effect is the same as everything else here. The state reached into your workshop and made sure you could never grow big enough to matter on your own. And you still haven't touched the thing that made silk worth killing for. The color. Purple. Not the washed out lilac we think of now, but a deep, dense, blood and shadow purple made from murex sea snails. Thousands of them crushed for a few grams of dye. In Byzantium, that color was not a fashion choice. It was a rank. It was, quite literally, imperial. And the book of the Eparch draws the line in iron. The silk dyers, your guild, are forbidden to make up the prohibited grades of purple, the great mantles, the whole-colored pieces, the deep dyes reserved for the court and the emperor. You may work certain lighter, mixed tints, a peach purple combined with other colors, common patterns in the provincial style. But the moment you cross into the true imperial grades, you have committed a crime. These forbidden goods even had a name. Kekolymena, the prohibited things, and they weren't just banned from your loom, they were banned from leaving. You could not dye with them, you could not sell them abroad, and if you were caught helping a foreigner smuggle them out, the punishment was the whole set. Flogged, shaved, property confiscated. So who was allowed to make the imperial purple? The emperor. Specifically the imperial workshops, the gynosia, run by the state inside and beside the great palace. The finest silk in the world, the purple that meant power, was minted, and mint is the right word, by the crown for the crown. Your private workshop existed to make everything below that line. You were permanently and by design the second best silk maker in your own city, and the law made certain you stayed there, which raises the obvious question. Why? Why would any state take its most lucrative luxury industry and hobble it this deliberately, splitting it 5 ways, capping it, and reserving the crown of it for itself? To answer that, we have to go back 400 years before your workshop opened to the single most consequential act of industrial espionage in the ancient world. For most of Roman history, silk came from China, and the Romans had almost no idea how it was actually made. They thought it grew on trees. It reached the Mediterranean overland, and the last great middleman on that road was Persia, the Sassanid Empire, Byzantium's oldest and deadliest enemy. The Persians controlled the flow. They set the price. And when the 2 empires went to war, which was often, the Persians simply cut the silk off. Rome was paying its worst enemy in gold for a luxury it could not produce and could not do without. Then, around the year 552, under the Emperor Justinian, according to the historian Procopius, two monks walked into the story. They had been in the East, most likely Nestorian Christians who had traveled as far as the silk-producing lands, and they had seen the secret with their own eyes. Silk did not grow on trees. It was spun by a worm that ate mulberry leaves. And they offered Justinian a proposition. They could get him the worm. The legend says they smuggled silkworm eggs out of the East hidden inside hollow bamboo canes, packed with straw to keep them dormant on the long road back to Constantinople. The eggs survived. They hatched under the monks' care. And with them, the Byzantine silk industry was born. Two honest notes on that story in the spirit of not selling you a fairy tale. The exact date is disputed. Some historians say 552, some say a decade later. And the picturesque detail of the bamboo canes comes to us through legend as much as through hard record. Procopius, our main witness, is frustratingly brief about the mechanics, but the shape of it is not in doubt, and the shape is what matters. A state at war engineered the theft of a foreign monopoly in order to stop paying its enemy and start pocketing the profit itself. That is the key to everything you're standing in. Byzantine silk was never a free market craft that the government happened to tax. It was a state asset from the first hatching worm. It was captured deliberately as an instrument of policy to drain Persia's coffers and fill the emperor's. So when you buy your workshop 400 years later and find the whole trade fenced, licensed, split, and capped, you are not looking at bureaucratic overreach. You are looking at the logical end state of an industry that was born as a weapon. And that tells you what your cloth actually was. Not just a luxury, a tool of the state. Which brings us to the second business your workshop was secretly part of, the one that never appears on your ledger. Diplomacy. Byzantine silk was how the empire spoke to the world without spending soldiers. Emperors handed out silk garments, the scaramangia, as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers and envoys, a way of dazzling and rewarding and reminding everyone who sat at the center of the world. Inside the city, silk was rank made visible. Who could wear which grade, which color, which cut was fixed by law and by status. The cloth was a language. And a state does not let just anyone print its language. This is where the export controls turn from strange to obvious. The Book of the Eparch requires that any silk garment worth more than 10 numismata be declared to the Eparch, so the authorities knew exactly where it was going. Foreigners were barred from buying the prohibited purples, from buying large restricted pieces, from buying unsewn cloth except for their own personal use, and from buying any silk over that 10 numismata line at all. And when a foreign visitor left the city, his purchases had to be reported to the Eparch's office, so nothing slipped out unwatched. You want to know what that felt like from the outside? We have an eyewitness, and he was furious. In the year 968, a bishop named Liutprand of Cremona came to Constantinople as an ambassador from the Western Emperor Otto. He was not a fan of the Byzantines to begin with, and they gave him plenty of fresh material. On his way home at the border, the customs officers went through his baggage and confiscated the purple silks he had bought in the city. Prohibited grades, not for export. Liutprand was outraged, and his revenge was to sneer in writing that back in his own country, such purple was so unremarkable that even prostitutes and cheap conjurers wore it. He missed the point entirely, and his missing it is the whole lesson. To Liutprand, it was just expensive fabric, and if cheap versions existed in the West, the Byzantine fuss looked absurd. But the Byzantines were not protecting a fabric. They were protecting a currency of status that they alone controlled the mint on. The purple wasn't valuable because it was a rare cloth. It was valuable because the emperor decided who was allowed to have it. The scarcity was the product. And your workshop, remember, was licensed to make everything except that. So by now, the picture of your business is clear, and it is a strange one. You own a genuinely profitable luxury operation in the hardest currency in the world, protected from foreign competition by centuries of state monopoly. And you are boxed in on every side. You can't integrate, you can't make the best grade, you can't sell freely to foreigners, you can't grow past a certain size, and 5 other people's fortunes are riding on your good behavior. Is there any way out of the box? There was, and it wasn't in Constantinople, it was in the provinces. From roughly the 10th century onward, silk weaving spread out of the capital into the Greek mainland, Corinth, Athens, Thessaloniki, and above all, one city that became the beating heart of provincial silk, Thebes. Out in the provinces, the suffocating five-guild machine of the capital didn't grip so tightly, and something remarkable grew up. The Theban weavers became so good that, according to the historian Nicetas Choniates, even the Byzantine emperors had to come and buy their finest goods from Thebes, Corinth, and Athens. Read that again. The imperial court, which ran its own workshops, was buying provincial silk. The provinces had outwoven the capital. We even have a traveler's head count. Around the 1160s, a Jewish traveler named Benjamin of Tudela passed through Greece and recorded what he saw. In Thebes, he found a community of some 2,000 Jews, and he singled them out as the finest dyers and silk makers in the whole of Greece. A named witness, an actual number, a specific city. This was a real, thriving, world-class silk industry, and it had more room to breathe and more room to profit than the licensed weavers back in Constantinople ever did. So there's your answer. If you want to get rich owning a silk workshop, don't open in the capital under the Eparch's thumb. Open in Thebes, build a name, and outweave the emperor's own factories. That's the play. Except, here is where the whole thing turns. And it turns on the one fact I told you to hold on to. Your real capital was not the looms. It was the hands. And hands can be stolen. In the year 1147, the Norman king Roger II of Sicily sent a fleet east and fell on the Byzantine silk towns. His men sacked Corinth, they sacked Thebes, and the plunder they carried home was not just gold and cloth. It was the weavers themselves. According to Nicetas Choniates, the people the Normans dragged away from Thebes were the silk weavers, many of them women, the very hands that made the cloth. They were shipped back to Palermo as captives to set up and teach the craft in Sicily. A Western chronicler, Otto of Freising, put it with brutal clarity. The Normans carried off the workers who wove the silk cloths, he wrote, to the shame of the Byzantine emperor and the glory of their own prince. And it worked. After 1147, Sicily began producing high-quality figured silks, the kind with lions and eagles woven in, strikingly similar to the Byzantine imperial patterns. The technology didn't leak, it was kidnapped. Now feel that, as the owner. Everything you built, the reputation, the finished cloth, the profit, all of it rested on a small number of irreplaceable skilled people. You could lock your gold in a chest. You could bar your door against thieves. You could not bar it against an army that had figured out the workers were worth more than the warehouse. In this business, the asset had legs, and one bad afternoon in the harbor could see your entire competitive advantage rowed across the sea and set to work for a rival king. The thing that made a provincial workshop great concentrated human skill was the exact thing that made it stealable. And that was only the fast death. The slow one was already coming, and it was bigger than any raid. For 500 years, Byzantium had held a near monopoly on high silk in the Christian world, and that monopoly is what made your license worth 10 numismata and worth the Eparch's blessing. The whole value of being a licensed Byzantine silk maker rested on the fact that almost nobody else in the West could do it, but that wall was crumbling. Sicily now had the craft. Courtesy of those stolen Thebans, Italian cities, Lucca first, then Venice, Florence, Genoa, were building their own silk industries. And Byzantium had spent the same decades signing away its commercial edge to the Italians. As early as 1082, the Emperor Alexios granted the Venetians sweeping trade privileges inside the empire, and Byzantine merchants increasingly found foreigners eating their lunch in their own markets. Then came the blow that landed on top of all the underlying rot. In 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade, who were supposed to be marching on Jerusalem, instead turned aside and sacked Constantinople itself. The imperial city, the center of the whole silk world, was looted by the very Westerners who were now learning to make silk of their own. The monopoly didn't so much collapse as evaporate, And once silk was being woven in Palermo and Lucca and Venice, a Constantinople license to weave the emperor's second-best cloth was worth exactly what a permit is worth when anyone can do the thing it permits. Nothing. So let's do the honest arithmetic, the way you'd actually have lived it. And a caution first, in fairness. No neat annual account book survives for a single Byzantine silk workshop the way ledgers survive for later Italian firms. What follows is a reasoned reconstruction built on the documented rules, the known value of the currency, and the shape of the trade, not a spreadsheet pulled out of a Byzantine chest. The pattern is solid even where the exact coins are estimates. A good year looks like this. The city is at peace, the raw silk is flowing in from Syria and the provinces, and prices are stable. You buy your metaxa from the dressers, you dye and weave the permitted grades, the fine mixed colors, and the figured cloths the court and the wealthy actually want, and you sell finished pieces to the vestiopertai at your regulated margin. Individual garments run into the many numismata. Remember the 10 numismata line that triggered a report to the Eparch was a threshold, not a ceiling. And the best pieces sat well above it. Across a year, a well-run workshop in a strong market could clear a genuinely comfortable surplus in stable gold. Not the fortune of a great merchant banker because the state has capped and fenced you at every turn, but a solid, respectable upper-tier income in the hardest money in the world. Enough to keep your 5 guarantors happy and your name on the roll. A bad year is not a low number, it's a knife. Raw silk prices spike because a war has closed the Syrian roads. And remember, you are forbidden from going out and sourcing your own supply, so you pay whatever the merchants above you demand. Or an inspector finds a piece on your loom that strays into a prohibited purple, and now it is not a bad year. It is flogging, shaving, and confiscation, and your 5 guarantors are ruined alongside you. Or worst of all, and slowest of all, the ships from Italy start arriving full of silk as good as yours and cheaper. And the protected market that justified your whole existence quietly stops being protected. Your costs are fixed. Your looms, your workers, your license, your rent, your revenue is not. And a fence that keeps competitors out is worth nothing the day the competitors are already inside the walls. So who actually got rich in Byzantine silk? Follow the money and it lands where it always lands in these stories. And it is almost never the person you'd guess. Not the weaver at the loom, whose extraordinary skill was precisely what made them a target to be captured rather than an owner to be enriched. Not really the licensed sericarios in Constantinople either, boxed in on 5 sides, capped, forbidden the best grade, never allowed to grow. The provincial operators in Thebes did better, the diversified silk families who built real wealth out in the freer air of the Greek mainland, and for a couple of centuries they did very well indeed. Right up until the afternoon, their competitive advantage was road to Palermo. But the entity that got rich, truly, structurally, permanently rich, off Byzantine silk was the state. The emperor kept the freehold on the entire industry. He owned the top grade outright through his own workshops. He set the rules, took the license fees, controlled the exports, and used the cloth itself as a currency of diplomacy and rank that cost him a fraction of what it bought him in loyalty and prestige. Every private workshop in the empire was, in the end, a subcontractor to a monopoly the crown never let out of its hands. You could get comfortable owning a silk workshop. You were never going to own silk. Silk owned you, and the emperor owned silk. And here is the last turn, the one that outlived every emperor, every guild, and every weaver in this whole story. The workshops are gone. The gynecia are gone. Constantinople fell, first to the Crusaders, finally to the Ottomans in 1453, and the secret of the imperial purple died with it. The Theban weavers were scattered. The licensed sericarioi are dust. Every institution in this episode is gone, but the idea outlived all of them. The craft they stole from the Thebans became the Italian silk industry, and out of that came Lucca, and Venice, and eventually the silk of the whole Renaissance. The West kept the worm and the loom, and more than the craft, they kept the deeper trick Byzantium had perfected, the discovery that a fabric could be turned into a controlled currency of status, that a state or a guild or a house could take a material and, by controlling who was permitted to wear it, make it worth more than its weight in the gold it was measured in. That idea, luxury as permission, status as something the powerful license, and the rest of us rent, did not die in 1453. It is the argument behind every restricted, gate-kept, status-signaling luxury good that has ever carried a price far beyond its cost. So could you get rich owning a Byzantine silk workshop? You could get comfortable. You could get respected. In a good decade, in the right city, you could get genuinely wealthy in the hardest money the medieval world ever minted. But understand what you were actually buying. Because it was never the cloth. You were buying a licensed seat at the one table where an empire had learned to turn thread into power. Everything that mattered most about that table, the purple, the monopoly, the meaning, belonged to the man at the head of it, and he was never going to sell you his chair. The silk never made anyone rich. The permission did, and the permission was never yours to keep.